Hello.
Hello,
Hey, hope you're doing good. How is your day going so far?
I'm good. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. I know we've had an interview since the last one. I remember it was I think but from my feedback it was very borderline. I felt as though for senior it would have been an easy yes. For staff level, I gave some recommendations, some things to look at in order to convert. So maybe give me a run through of what you've done since then. That way at least I can come in, with a new set of difficulties depending on your practice.
Um, I haven't done a whole lot actually. I've just given like a couple of more interviews.
Mhm.
Just tried to like get comfortable with the process and
Mhm.
uh, just to be able to think on the spot, organize my thoughts, and present it during an interview.
Mhm.
Um, I've also started reading some more system design problems
Mhm.
just to get myself familiar with, a few more domains, just so that if an unfamiliar problem pops up, right, I might have some idea if I've like done some prior reading on it. Yeah.
I see. Excellent. Okay, yeah. And if I remember correctly, you are going through Alex Chu's book, right?
I have gone through his book earlier. I just ordered his volume two.
Nice,
I've
nice.
read like
Mhm.
two problems from it. Haven't really uh, read the whole thing, but yeah.
Excellent. Okay. And at least final line of question on that. Have you had any interviews since the last session? And if so, how did they go, or how did you feel they went?
No, no real interviews.
Mhm.
I had a couple of mock interviews, so they were both leaning higher. So that
Mhm.
was an improvement
Excellent.
from last time.
That is good. Excellent, excellent work. Okay, cool. And so that makes sense. So maybe give me a run through at least for today. In this case, is there any specific aspects you'd like to focus on, or do you want me to throw a problem your way and then we just grill through it?
Yeah, I think similar to what we did last time. Let's just go through a problem. And as you gave me, some tips on what's expected out of staff level and what I can do uh, to make sure that I don't get down leveled, right? So those kinds of things would be helpful.
Perfect. Okay, that makes sense. So I'll try and take you out of your comfort level for this one here. So I think I've been very interested in this problem because it's very fundamental. I feel like it's one of the high level ones, but we're gonna try and design a banking ledger. And for clarity here, I'll give you some initial assumptions. That way, at least you're not focused on the wrong aspect of the system. Assume the front end client exists, and you can also assume, it could be an ATM system or just Zelle or support for PayPal. So basically, the only thing I'll note here, do note that it's multiple sources of transactions, e.g., PayPal, Zelle, or even direct deposit slash checks. So we want to make an assumption that that bit exists. That said, when you are going through it, if you need any particular features from it, list expectations in terms of requests. So if you expect a request might come in from any of these clients, feel free to list it. Just give me the expected interface structure. But the core bit I want you to focus on is how do you even handle these requests from this system? Like if it's authentication, if it's transactions, security, etc. So I want you to be like the person behind the loop that nobody really knows. Now build that system out for me. Is that okay?
Um, yeah, sure.
It's a good challenge, huh?
Sorry?
It's quite a good challenge this one, huh? And for context, I'll even do this for you because I know you're a fan of Alex Shoes. I'll give you this. banking ledger, so that after you're done, you can go through the way Alex Hu has done it, so that you also at least have reference. So depending on what you come up with, also look into how they did it, and then see if you can gain any lessons from it. Don't open this yet, but the point is, it's actually something that they discuss in depth. So I want to just see
Yeah,
what you can
yeah.
do now, and then how you can improve on that later.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, let's start with the functional requirements. Okay, so there's like a lot of things I believe, within a banking system or a banking ledger. So we want to like at least narrow down a few requirements which we can discuss, and we can go from there, right? So
Mhm.
I guess the first thing that comes to mind is um, user sign up, uh, and opening a new bank account. Is that something, since you mentioned that we'll be focusing on the ledger uh, part of it, right? So is this
Mhm.
something that we can assume that is already done and we don't have to discuss this in too much detail?
Yep. So for now, assume that the user sign up experience exists. That said, there is one aspect that I'll need you to think about, and that's the authentication bit. So it will be good for you to talk about the expected protocols, and mainly in light of how you use the tokens, because we expect the ledger system to be sensitive about the tokens. So just be mindful of that authentication bit, but you don't have to design the core user experience.
Got it. So I'll just write that down. Users already exist. We do need to make sure that uh, we are authenticating the users properly. Okay. Uh, the second um, requirement that comes to mind is basically deposits, right? So now there are different kinds of deposits. One is like cash deposit. Then we
Mhm.
have auto deposits, like uh, payroll, etc. Um, um, and then, as you mentioned, that there can be deposits uh, from external third parties like PayPal, um, and other applications, right?
Mhm. Yep, that is
So
accurate.
which, yeah, do we need to focus on all of them? I've, I, I've never really worked on something like this before, but I would imagine
Mhm.
that there is some sort of common a ledger or a transaction processing system which powers all of these, right? Uh, but having said that, these would still be there would still be different backend services handling different kind of transactions, and they'll have different kind of APIs that they might be exposing to the outside world, right? So which ones should we focus on for this?
That's an excellent point. You've for a person who's never seen this, it is actually impressive that you thought about that, and that process is actually referred to as reconciliation. And for reference, you've seen how in banks sometimes you send money, but it shows on the account, but it doesn't really. It still shows as pending until, let's say, the next day. So that process of resolving all of
Right.
that is called reconciliation. And for our purposes, you can assume we have, or at least in our case, we are worried about designing an API where each of these services can communicate with it. So this is our internal API, but it has external facing endpoints, right? So external facing endpoints. So this bit right here, I would want you to maybe design one or two endpoints where, let's say, PayPal can communicate with us. Same case, let's say, ATM systems, our ATM systems can also communicate with us. So I would want you to think about if an ATM was to make a request and PayPal can make a request, is there something common amongst them? Is there something different? And how can I identify that as part of the request?
Got it.
So,
Got it. I think another hash deposit and check deposits, I guess, mentioned that as well. Similarly, I guess we have withdrawals, right? So similarly, I would say you have cash withdrawal checks. Um, you can have deauthorized, deauthorized wire transfers and whatnot. And then third-party apps as well. We'll discuss how our internal service is going to look like, and we'll
mhm.
probably go through a couple of use cases with different. Um, I think other common feature is like users looking at their balance, something users viewing their balance, something that we should support. Um There's also like joint accounts and whatnot.
Mhm.
Is that something we want to discuss or?
For now, let's not worry about that. Assume that those are all handled by the, black box that you mentioned up there. So the front end client, assume that that handles all of that.
Okay, makes sense. Um, um, Transaction history for a user. I think that's another common one.
Mhm.
Is that something we should be including in the scope?
Uh, okay, maybe let's make a quick statement on it. So assuming that we have a database, and maybe talk to me, if you were to store transaction data in a DB, what kind of DB would you choose? Because I would imagine getting the transaction would be a simple query on that. So what kind of DB would you choose for that? Just to gloss over this before
Yeah, for
we go.
sure. Yeah, for sure. I think the obvious choice that comes to mind here is an asset compliant database, since we'll be dealing with transactions.
Makes sense.
So I think like Postgres or MySQL, something like that, should
Excellent.
be
Do you have a
a good
preference
choice.
between one of the two?
I have a preference for Postgres because that allows us to, that helps with handling concurrent requests better.
Perfect. Yep. I think that's it. Full points. That's good. I think that's the point I was looking for. So let's keep going with this.
Okay, okay, I think this is a good list to basic. Another thing that I just wanted to mention was maybe we will not have time to discuss it as, but like dispute and etc. Right, and then disputes. There is fraud, etc., which needs to be there even if we discuss it or if we don't discuss it. But that's
But
these are
let
another
me
like some of the essential things.
let me generalize these two into one point that I think would help address them, and particularly we'll call it security. Oh, sorry, I don't know, I deleted them. So we'll call all of this, let's see. And the reason I'm saying this way, security, regulation, and compliance, they all fall under this bracket. But when you're going through the question, don't worry about this or this. I'll particularly be interested in this, and the reason is banks are usually global services, and so tax implications, let's say reporting and auditing are something that we expect. So when you're designing it, keep in mind that we expect to comply to government rules. So think of monitoring particularly to facilitate this bit. And I think this is one bit of feedback I had given you last time. So how can we facilitate it? So make sure you pay special attention to that part, okay?
Okay. Okay. Makes sense. Um, yeah, we can discuss the reporting bit as well. Um, if you're okay with this list, or if you think we're not missing anything obvious, then I would like to move on and discuss some of the non-functional requirements as well.
Yep, this works for me. This is good.
Okay, let's look at some one requirements. Okay. Okay, let's quickly see that as you mentioned already, security is pretty important. Security, privacy uh, is kind of given that it's a banking uh, application. We need to make sure that it's secure, user data is private, and only visible to authorized parties. Um, Second thing is that system should always be consistent. So high
Mhm.
consistency. We don't want no partial transactions. Uh, uh, System should be highly available. This one is a little debatable. I've still seen some of the banking apps,
Mhm.
especially their online functionality. Sometimes they do take some downtime to resolve some issues, and or I don't know if it's related to compliance or whatnot, but
Mhm.
they do prefer consistency over availability.
Now, let's actually think a bit further about that. So, when it comes to consistency, what type of consistency do you typically see with banks, and what type of consistency do you think makes sense?
Um, the consistency that I see is, in the transactions, right?
Mhm.
So basically, there won't be a case where, let's say, a transfer was initiated and a withdrawal happened from one side, but the money never showed up in the second account, right? Uh, so there is always the data consistency is always there, but consistency with respect to like all the different services being available all the time, that's not necessarily the case.
Makes sense. Let me be more specific about what I'm looking for here. So, if I would imagine you've seen how with banks, when you make a withdrawal, it might, yes, reduce the amount, but the transaction will still say pending until the next day, like maybe at midnight, they resolve all of it, and then now you see the fully updated balance. So I'm looking for the flavor of consistency here, because I think it could be immediate consistency. It could also be eventual consistency. Like, I'm curious, what type of consistency do you think would make sense in this context and why?
Um, okay. Uh, so I
Mhm.
would say eventual consistency uh, with respect to the balances and everything. But I do think that there has to be some sort of uh, most recent view allowing users to see, like what's the uh, yeah, I mean strong consistency, yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's the term we're looking for here.
okay, I see. I guess when I mentioned high consistency, I should have said strong consistency there. So that's what I meant basically when I said that. Okay, there
Understood.
shouldn't be like partial transaction or anything. So
Makes sense.
um, yeah, okay.
All right, that makes sense. Yeah,
Uh,
I was drilling that particular point because high consistency didn't make too much sense, and I wanted to make sure at least to refresh on those terms. But that's good. I think we can keep
yeah,
going.
yeah, no, makes sense. Okay, let's quickly talk about the scale of the transactions and data that we are handling. So, um, how many users should we assume to begin with? Uh, I
For
would
now,
gonna say
yeah,
like,
let me make your life
yeah,
easier.
sorry.
Let's not worry too much about traffic. Particularly, we can assume it's in
Okay,
the millions in this regard, but you don't have to do any numbers calculations. That said, I would want you to think about API design, and I also would want you to think about how you would actually make this a global service. So when you're designing some of the components, assume that we are receiving traffic from different areas, different types of, let's say, uh, currencies. Like if you want to have like some central service, I would want to hear about that. But for now, don't worry about like the core skill. Just assume it's in the millions of users.
okay, got it. So, okay, yeah, I think we can talk about some of the points that you mentioned as we go further into the design. But let's talk about the API and how that API is going to look like for some of these things.
All right, that makes sense. Let's keep going.
So for API, since we said that okay, we are not worried about the user sign up, but we are worried about making sure that the user is authenticated. Um, so regarding the authentication bit, one approach that comes to mind is to use web tokens for authentication. And the reason why I'm saying web tokens is that they are basically easier. They are lightweight in terms of how much state is required on the server side.
Mm-hmm.
And also, since it's a banking app, what we can do is we'll have web tokens which are somewhat short-lived. So what's an ideal duration? We can probably discuss that. But at least in my experience, I've seen most banking applications will kind of log you out after, like, let's say 5 minutes if you're not doing any activity, right?
That makes sense. Yeah. And
So, and
speaking of that point,
another, sorry, yeah,
yeah, let's expand a
right?
bit more on that point. So I'll just do this quickly. So say yeah, that's a really good point. I agree with you. So I want you to fill this in for me. So verb. So let's say we have a V1, and then let's say generate token or something. Maybe yeah, I'm giving generic names here, and then maybe some account ID here. Assume something along the lines. So I want you to talk in depth to me about multiple aspects of this. So and then when you fill this in, I won't ask you any other questions about the API. So then design the request structure, so the payload here. And then I also need to design the expected response. And specifically here, I would want you to talk about status code and then any other information that you think might be useful. So I want you to dig into this bit here and particularly talk about the token types, authentication methods, and then fill this in for us. That way we can like make sure this is structured enough. Does this make sense?
Yes, yes.
All right.
Yeah, I also wanted to briefly touch on like uh, two-factor authentication for like some of the things like uh, uh, initiating a transfer or initiating some kind of withdrawal. So that's another thing that from security point of view. Um, yeah, so the generate token request. So this would be very much like an authentication request, right? So to generate a token, we'll need the username, um, and the password, right? And then it can return you the okay. After verifying the username and password, this would be basically the verb would be a post here. Then it can the be a token, uh, and then to make life of the client easier, we can also return the expiration timestamp. Um, so this is just like a timestamp, which is a number. So why I'm saying expiration timestamp can be returned here is that so that the client knows that okay, or if the client needs to, let's say, notify the user that hey, your session is going to be expiring soon, or what have you, they can do that without really querying the server again.
Mhm.
Um, I would say
Let's
on similar on similar lines, there can be a refresh request as well, where you just provide the token and say that request type is a refresh, right? So in that way, we say that okay, the user is still
I'm curious about one thing here because the moment you mentioned it, this is actually exactly what I was targeting. So I want to have us dig into this discussion a bit more. So the first thing I want us to think about is this part here. So you chose post as the verb. So is there a reason you went for it? And can you see any issues potentially happening if we use a post request?
uh, so what else would I use? So um,
And I
yeah, I
can give an
think
example there.
the reason. Yeah, sure. So I could use a GET request. I see like if from a RESTful perspective, post is something that generates, well, it is generating a new token, right? So and other uh, like get request is another option, but then you'll be specifying URL parameters in the URL, which if you're doing it via browser, that may not be the best choice, is what I'm thinking.
Like, is there any issue that you see that could happen with the post request? And particularly, I can give an example. Let's say I have three browser sessions, maybe one on my main computer here, another one on, let's say, some public computer, or let's say your wife's computer that gets hacked, and another one maybe on your phone. So if I sign in on all these devices simultaneously and they each use post, do you think, do you see any potential security vulnerabilities with that?
Um,
Or similarly, let's say I open three tabs, one being, let's say, incognito, and then the other one normally, and they all make a post request. Like, what would happen in that case?
right.
Mhm.
So in that case, yeah, I think what you're saying is that if you get multiple post requests when there is already a token which is associated with the user, uh, so I guess. we can return the same token. Let's say if the multiple requests are coming from the browser itself,
Mhm.
then the backend should be smart enough to recognize that okay, the user agent is still the same. Then just return the token that we've just created, right?
Yep.
Uh, and
And what
if let's say the request is coming from a different device, maybe the token can be device specific.
That's it. So I was gonna
Does
say this is actually I'm pushing on that point because that's exactly what the put request is for. So it's basically a
okay.
post request that is idempotent. So when you make the request, if a token is already there, it will return the same token. So this maintains consistency with the session expiry, right?
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You're right. Put might be a better verb here. Um,
Right.
yeah. Yeah.
And
That makes sense. Yeah.
awesome. And then the other question I have is particularly with this one here. So, well, okay, put would somewhat address it, but do you, if you go with this structure, at least in my mind, it seems as though we are going with a client managed token. And I think you hinted at this by saying that way we don't have to make a request again to the server to refresh the token because we have the expiry. But can you see any potential vulnerabilities with this happening? If so, like, do you think
So
maybe?
okay. Yes. Just to clarify, so my understanding is that the token that you have, basically, uh, it's an encrypted info, right? So the
Mhm,
client doesn't know how to interpret that. So the expiration timestamp is still it's encoded in the token and is still
mhm,
managed by the server itself, but it's an info that's provided to the client. Let's say if you have a mobile client
mhm.
uh, interacting, and I would usually see the mobile client telling you that, hey, your session is expiring in so in so much time, right? So
I see.
so to support that kind of functionality, that's why I'm returning it here. I don't necessarily see that to be a security concern,
I see your point. Yeah. The
unless
only reason,
uh,
yeah, the only reason I was asking that is because typically JWT, the expiration will be part of the token. So if you decode the JWT token, and typically the client will do that,
right.
the token will have the expiration as part of the data. And that's actually where I was a bit concerned. But in this case, so this is the payload, not the token. So it's a combination of the payload and extra information, which is the expiry, which is good. So that eliminates that
Yeah,
vulnerability in
yeah,
itself. Excellent. Makes sense?
yeah.
All
So
right.
I guess, yeah,
Mhm.
but the client wouldn't know how to decode the token, right? That's why I
Understood.
was returning um, okay. I think we're spending too much time on this. Um, Next, what else do we have? We have authentication. We have deposit. Um, okay, we have withdrawal. Um, and we have users viewing their balance. Let's go with the easier one, I guess. That is viewing balance, right? So that's gonna be a get request. So slash v1 slash balance. Or like slash ID slash. That could be one way of um, um, doing it, or maybe the other way of doing it is like this, and with an account ID
I'll take,
parameter specified.
yeah. Don't worry about the rest of them. I think the core bit was that that one above. I wanted to just make sure we have that in-depth discussion, but I trust your API knowledge now, so I think you can skip over this section.
Okay, okay, let's move on. Let's move on to Let's move on to like the database uh, entities that we would need. We'll need a user entity with some attributes. Let's say email, etc. That's user entity. Then we'll need an account entity, and then account would have an account ID. Another thing that comes to mind is the type of account, check,
Mhm.
saving, balance is another obvious one. And there might be something else, but these are like, the major ones. Then there has to be a user account relationship table where you have, the user ID and user ID and account ID at the very minimum. And why I've kept it separate is because you can have joint ownership and whatnot. So one user can have multiple accounts and one account can be linked to multiple. So it's like a many to many relationship.
Makes sense.
That's why it's um then comes a transaction um entity. So this should have our transaction ID. It should have a type, some type. So like withdrawal, is it a deposit, etc. Um, Now it can have an amount field, right? Then it will have an associated account. Now, I guess question here is like, does one transaction belong to one account only, or is it a multiple account thing? In my head, it's one account only because you have like transactions coming from third parties or external banks and whatnot. Um, so for example, in this case, if we are talking about a transaction which is happening within the bank, let's say from one account to another account, I would assume that there is two entries posted in that, right? One for withdrawal and one for like uh, deposit, right? Um, that that's what I'm thinking.
That makes sense. Okay. I agree with that approach. I think
But um, yeah, I think and this would allow us to basically get the transaction history uh,
mhm.
associated with the particular user bank account. Um, we haven't really talked about the scale of the database, but in the interest of time, I'm just gonna like share my thoughts briefly. I'm gonna say that it's going to be a
Mhm.
relation, relational database. And then, since it's a worldwide, let's say a global bank, let's just assume that the scale is high enough that we'll need to do some kind of sharding.
Mhm.
So, and the most obvious choice that comes to my mind is sharding by the uh, user ID, because most of the operations that we are going to do here, at least the user-facing operations that we'll be doing here, will be uh, limited to like a particular user's account, or will always have the user info associated with most of these operations, right? So we
Mhm.
should be able to target the right partition based on the user ID.
That makes sense. And out of curiosity, are you also going to do replication in this regard?
Yes, replication would be, I would say it'll be like a primary and and follower with multiple followers.
All right. And for the replicas in this
Uh,
case, given that it's a global service, are you going to globally replicate or are you going to do it with some sort of heuristic? Like, particularly, I'm just thinking, we have, if we let's say want to support users both in Europe, both in the US, by maybe somewhere in Asia and Africa, then do you want to replicate US data in Europe or like, is there a criteria you'll be mindful of?
so this should be local to the region. So there'll be replicas, and so you have usually if we're talking about let's say Amazon, right? AWS has a data center which is uh, and then they have replica which are like multiple availability zones in the same region, right? So that's how it will be, but it does present a challenge in the sense that let's say a user moved from the west coast to east coast, then how do you handle that kind of scenario, right? So I would assume that there is some kind of a backend service uh, running or which gets triggered, let's say, when a user basically accesses it with from a location which is not his primary location, and then some kind of data migration happens for the user so that basically they don't experience that same latency once they moved. So that kind of design is coming to my mind.
Makes sense. I agree. I think that makes sense. And do you see this, in addition to this, do you see this being any problematic, especially from a compliance perspective, and particularly tax laws?
Yeah,
Like,
so yeah, that's another thing that I wanted to mention. Basically, limiting the data to a particular region would also enable us to meet any data regulations that are there, right? So that, uh, but yeah, if they're moving, and then I guess yeah, that does bring up that question that okay, now if the user has moved, I'm not really sure like
mhm,
uh, what the regulations say in those cases, right? So let's say if the regulations don't allow us,
mhm.
then yeah, we could like I really don't know if if we are allowed to cache it temporarily, or what happens in those cases, or like the user has to live with some latency in terms of accessing their data.
That makes sense. Okay, so I'm being mindful of time here, and so I'll ask you one more question that I think we should spend the remainder of the time on. So we have talked about regulation. We have talked about what do you call it? Sharding in this regard. Now I'm curious about the process of reconciliation, particularly. So maybe, at least for the design, like for diagramming purposes, just design for me how you would actually reconcile this. And I would urge you to think of one bit. So we know we'll have data or transactions that happened ages ago, many, many years ago, and we still want the users to have access to them, but we know they won't be accessing it immediately. And we'll also have transactions that are happening recently, and we will probably also have statements. So I'm interested in three sections here. One, I want you to talk to me about the storage architecture for historical data, recent data, and recently seen data and the most recent transactions that are actually pending. So I want to see the architecture for the three of those, and then I'm also curious about how you're going to resolve those recent ones. So I want to see you just design that component there. So if you want to diagram that, that's okay. If you want to just talk about it, that's also okay.
Yeah, I guess we can shift to a whiteboard. Um, yeah, okay. So as I mentioned initially, right? Uh, so we have y minus Uh, so let's call it let's call it transaction service. I'm just drawing the service bit here, right?
Mhm.
So this gets the user request. I would assume there is a load balancer here, and this is like a distributed service. It has some sort of um, cache for validating, or if it's if we discussed actually using web tokens, so maybe that's not even required. Um, so it validates the session for the user, and then it goes ahead and posts the transaction into a relational database. Uh, the transaction goes here. So now, what's the life cycle of this transaction, right? Uh, so I would assume that there are different types of transactions here happening. Some of them are just transfers between banks, which will be resolved pretty quickly. And then the other ones are, are let's say some kind of wire transfers or some other systems which would take some time to resolve, right? So in that, so I would say the transaction basically has a status bit and it gets posted as an initiated or something, and
Mhm.
then what we can do is after initiating it here, it can probably put it into some kind of a message queue to have that transaction being have like whatever the next step is for the given transaction to go through, right? So
Mhm.
that's one thing that I'm thinking. Now there has to be like some kind of a generic service here, which can be uh, transaction handler. And then this guy should basically know how to how to s- how to further process this transaction, right? So um, so this can trigger different services uh, based on the type of transaction and whatnot, right? If it's a wire transfer, there might be a wire transfer service that gets triggered. If it's a third party transaction that needs to be sent to a third
Mhm.
party, that so that there'll be like different services consuming and uh, consuming this. And then what they can do is basically update the status uh, service. They can update the status back onto our relational database and post the update back that okay, what's the status of this transaction now? So that's the kind of flow that I'm thinking that happens
Maybe I was gonna
here.
suggest, yeah, rather than the parties themselves, updating our DB because that could potentially cause vulnerabilities. Maybe we can respond based off of the response from the services because there will be individual APIs, right? So our transaction handler will send a request in this, or can maybe be like a queue, as you said, like it can send a request to the service, it receives a response, and then it be the one that makes the update rather than these systems themselves being given access to the DB. What do you think?
Yes, I think that makes sense. I should have added that. So instead of like, I don't know why this thing is. I don't know why this text is below. It should be here. Yeah. So I would say there is another service which kind of deals with the response. Uh, we can call it transaction resolver. Then based on what the payload is, it goes ahead and updates our database here, and that's basically for the recent transactions which are there, right? And then we can have some kind of archive DB as well, which makes sure that uh, so how would that work? I would say it can be like a cron job or something, right? I don't know if we have. Right. So this is like a data archiver, and this maybe runs, let's say, once once a month per user, right? And then what it does is like it goes ahead and it takes this data, maybe does some denormalization on it, and then puts it in some kind of a NoSQL storage or some kind of object storage for retrieval later.
Makes sense. And just out of curiosity, because that was actually another point I was looking at. I don't know if you've seen this terminology in AWS called data tiering, but this is exactly it, where you have some data on memory, some of it on cold storage. And can you see any benefits of this approach other than, let's say, the fact that it's okay? I'll mention the obvious one here. It helps with cost saving because only the most
Yeah,
recent data is in the quick memory. Can you see any other benefits
right.
in terms of performance?
Yeah, definitely, because this helps with how much data a database shard is storing. So the smaller the footprint of the data, the more data is kept in memory by the database itself, right? So your transactions, your reads are faster.
Right.
So uh, basically, so it helps with that aspect as well. And then also helps you, like going back to your point of cost, keep the footprint of these machines smaller,
Uh,
because the bigger the machines that you provision, the more expensive they get.
Excellent. Yeah, and it also follows the user pattern. Typically, people don't look at very old transactions, so we don't really need to commission the most powerful machines to serve this. They can be served on demand and then maybe perfectly cached, but for the most part, we don't want to keep them quickly accessible. That's why we have statements, and you have to you actually like load through the app before you actually view them, right?
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Makes sense.
All right. I
Um,
think this is a good point to stop because we have about 6 minutes left. But overall, I think I'm very satisfied with this answer. But as the same way we did it last time, maybe let's start with you. Like looking back at things. Oh, is there anything else you wanted to add just before we end? Just interrupt.
uh, no, I think sounds good. Let's go to the feedback, right? Yeah.
All right. So looking back at it,
Um,
yeah, what do you think you did well, and what do you think are points of improvement?
I think one thing I did well is that I was relaxed, kind of
Tell,
throughout
yeah.
this process. So
Uh,
yeah, I think it helps that I've like talked to you before as well. Uh, so that basically, I spent a good amount of time on functional requirements and listing down the various use cases, and
Mm.
that's kind of a good thing, so that at least I'm able shows that I was able to think about the problem holistically, give like different things that you would have to think about. So that part I thought was good. I think I covered non-functional requirements pretty well with that uh, uh, bad terminology for strong consistency. Should be more mindful of that. Um,
I'll just paste it in because
API
I'm laughing.
design, yeah,
Yeah, keep going,
yeah.
but you
API
mentioned it
design.
and I looked at it. But yeah, you're right. Sorry.
Uh, API design, I think it was generally okay, but I can spend more time on going through the nitty-gritties of, I actually know like where post and put should be used, but sometimes it's hard to like realize while you are interviewing, right? So yeah, it can definitely use more practice there. Again, I think the entity diagrams I think was pretty okay in my head. Um, can use some more, can use better time management and like maybe give some more time to the actual design diagram.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, TLDR, I think you know this is a pass. At least even for me, this is easy. Like you actually, it's really easy to see the improvement. And you're right. Like in fact, maybe the first piece of feedback I should have said, it's really great that you are relaxed. I could pick it up. The pace of your speech was excellent. And you did one thing. There's one behavioral thing that I usually find it hard to communicate to candidates, especially if they're not comfortable. You are okay asking me to skip over things. I feel like candidates in an interview tend to be afraid to do this, but it comes from a point of not being relaxed enough. But if you ask, it's not harmful, and it's okay because sometimes there's things that the interview is completely not interested in. So I feel like much of what I'll give you feedback on here is more interview specific and not content specific. This time you managed to bring it all, and this was actually a really good performance on my side. And so, as you can see on my feedback here, I think you kind of intuited much of what I was gonna say. Say, in fact, the terminologies are the same. You say just being mindful of the common terminologies. Those are the bits to be mindful of. I gave you like a quick summary. And the funny thing is, I know this actually is a flustering bit. In fact, I've been caught myself saying round robin being not a rate limiting approach. I think I said it was a was it? No, yeah, I said a rate limiting approach. I used, we can use rate limiting approaches like round robin, and then it hit me immediately. What the heck am I saying? And that kind of thing happens, and so just practice helps, of course. And in my case, the solution I ended up with was just having sticky notes to avoid that kind of mistake. But of course, more practice usually makes these things more intuitive. They're honestly confusing. There are way too many concepts. So at least for me, I typically don't take it out against the candidates because frankly speaking, even us, we don't necessarily configure load balancers daily. So you might be a staff engineer, but typically
Yeah,
you'll do it on demand and you'll read the documentation. So that's something I understand, but given the environment you're in right now, you'll find companies being pedantic about some of this bullshit. And so it's important to be mindful about that. But overall, I think this is an excellent performance, and I think you can also tell. And the bits of refinement are more or less interview specific. I think I pointed that bit out here. So let's see, give me 1 second. Uh, hmm, yeah, so this right here. So only suggestion here will be when you find yourself maybe doing something that feels repetitive. I could tell, like, let's say you've designed the user diagram, you've designed the account diagram, you're going back to the user diagram. I know that, sometimes as an interviewee, you can find yourself going down a rabbit hole. And it's okay. I mean, you kind of showcase the ability to do this, but I'm just going to call it so that you're mindful of it and feel free to do it again in real interviews. If you think it's redundant, feel free to like abstract over
mhm,
details. You can just mention, we could have extra information here, maybe things like addresses, but if they're not going to be useful for the ERD, skip over them. And this applies to pretty much any other component. Like if you're designing the API, it doesn't need to be an exhaustive request. You maybe do it once or twice, but if there's any extra additive information, you can just tell the interviewer, I can include extra information like this and that. Do you think it's important I write this? Just bring them in. That way, when you skip over it, they're okay with it. Like that way, they just see that you know what you want or what you could add there, but at least for the interview purposes, it's not going to add much. So the idea here is kind of refining the amount of information you're focusing on so that it's all additive. You don't want to like be repeating the same information. You want to make sure that every bit of information that you're writing in is expanding the interview or is expanding the interview or is adding to the information you've already shared. So, just more practice. I'll say like at this point, honestly, I'll give you like let's say 4 stars for pretty much everything, but it's more like you probably need one more. Don't jump in. Honestly, if you jump in tomorrow, you'll probably do well. But in my case, I want you to actually blow it out of the water. I want you to get the best of the best offers. But for the most part, check. You have the knowledge. It's apparent. The bits of refinement. I think those are clear. So maybe get one or two more interviews in just to make sure that you're not like caught with some of these silly details. Summarize them, summarize the
Right.
notes. That way, they're not an issue. But overall, I could tell that you're more comfortable with the process, and I'm really, really happy to see that. Huh?
Awesome. Thank you so much. Would this
Absolutely, yeah.
be a pass for, let's say, a staff level, or do you think still needs more work? Or
For me, yes, I would actually pass you for start. For now, but this is the thing. Senior, it's actually strong pass. Staff, I would say pass,
okay,
leaning strong pass. That said, I want it to be strong pass for staff, and that's why I recommended maybe get one more practice in so that those little bit the little bits that we talked about, like, let's say the terminologies that, caught you off guard here, make sure that you refine on those. That way, it's essentially spot on every aspect. So maybe get one more in, but I frankly feel like if you have interviews tomorrow, you'll probably be fine. That's kind of my point on this.
okay. I
All right?
actually have one on Tuesday, so yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
you will be fine. Yeah.
Wish
I
me
think
luck.
just
Thank you.
and go in relaxed. Be relaxed the same way you are today. Don't be flustered. Your knowledge is apparent, and with that relaxed attitude, you were able to really really move at a fast pace. So you did a really really good job here. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Good night.
Awesome. All right. You too. Have a good day.